My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I had a question on imposter syndrome, so I'm going to talk about that today. I also want to talk about what underscores imposter syndrome, which is also shame and low self-esteem. And we're going to talk about how this shows up in people's relationships. So let's take it from the top. Let's define imposter syndrome. It's the inability to believe that one's success is deserved or achieved through your own skills and efforts. In other words, maybe you're thinking that you got lucky somehow. How does this show up? It can show up as a person who is very successful, and maybe they have a lot of money in their bank account. But deep down inside, when they look in a mirror, they see a person who is poor, a person who is like 1 week away from being homeless. They don't see themselves as a successful person. How does this happen? How does a person do well in life, but yet underneath all that, there's a lot of shame? How is it possible that they have low self-esteem? How is it that they never feel good enough? Well, there's a lot of reasons and a lot of ways, but let's go with this today. I'm going to try to make this as concise as possible. I can do other shows on this later. What happens is every child is born the same way. They need to be seen. They want to be heard. And I wouldn't even say they want to. I would say they demand. They demand to be seen. They demand to be heard. They demand to be loved. They want to know that they matter. They want to know that they make a difference somehow. So that's the original template. However, what if you have parents or caregivers that are extremely critical? They're sarcastic. They break the child's boundaries. The child is not allowed to have their own opinions, thoughts, feelings, emotions, perceptions. They put it in the kid's mind that they're not good enough. The parent is more likely to point out all the mistakes the child is doing instead of patting them on the back for what's going well. The child starts to believe that they need to do something, to be something. They need to change themselves like a chameleon in some way to make themselves palatable to their caregiver. And so here they start to learn that love is completely conditional. Depending upon what the parent wants, they need to be that way. And so they will always be in a position of not feeling good enough. And there is no moment when the parent is going to say, you did that perfectly, now I'm going to show you love. This is a deficiency in the parents, not in the child. But there's no child alive that has the ability to understand that them not being loved in the correct way is not, they don't understand that it's not their fault. They think it is their fault, and so therefore they're trying to live up to the parents' standards. And this could start right from birth. What if the parents never say that they love their child? What if the parents never show any type of verbal or physical affection? This child, again, who demands love and attention and wants to matter, is going to be put in a position where they're going to do everything possible in order to get that love and attention. This brings upon an enhanced need for approval. The constant need to make things right without having any boundaries. A peacemaker at all costs. So what does this look like when they get older? What it could look like is you're in a relationship. Let's say relationships are 50-50. I know a lot of people like to throw words around and say, well, relationships are really 100 and 100%. I got it, but that's not the point for today. Let's say relationships are 50-50. One person is now giving 40%. The other person doesn't say, hey, you're not meeting my needs, that kind of thing. They'll immediately throw in 60%. Let's say the other person drops down to 10%. The other person immediately says, I can handle this. They move up to 90%. And it could be that the person is almost destitute, they're a drug addict, they're an alcoholic, and they're giving 0%. The other person picks it up 100%, no problem. I worked at an alcohol and drug rehab for quite a while, and what I've noticed there is, it's really interesting. I'm not saying people don't deserve love, I'm not saying that, but time and time again, and it was an all male facility, I would see guys that didn't have jobs, didn't have any money, addicts, didn't have show any ability to take responsibility for anything. They didn't treat people well. But almost always, when they were done with their 30 days, there would be a woman waiting with open arms, couldn't wait for them to be there. And this is extremely grating for some people with imposter syndrome. And I'm going to show you more of that as we go along. Now, let's look to the other part. What happens when you are trying all the time to get the love you want from a caregiver? You become addicted to the connection. You become addicted to the attachment. You become addicted to the relationship. In other words, the one that you want, not the one that you are getting. So you continuously work harder to get that. When you get older, this is part of your identity. It becomes part of your personality. And so you think it's on you to continue to work harder and harder to hold a relationship together, whether you are getting something positive out of it or not. This can also lead to perfectionism. Now, we can look at perfectionism as being a good thing for certain things, right? You want your cardiac surgeon to be a perfectionist, right? You want your accountant maybe to be a perfectionist. So we do encourage perfectionism in our society. However, the perfectionism that I'm talking about is where somebody is not getting the love that they want and they can't stand rejection. They can't stand the abandonment. And so what they do is they try to perfect themselves in every way possible. And they do that to lower down the chances of somebody rejecting them. In other words, if you make X amount of dollars, it's going to put you in a more lofty position. If you have a certain body or physique that's better than most, it's going to put you in a better position. If you're more highly educated, if you're more socially aware, all of these things should put you up the ladder, or so you would think. And so it would lower the chances of you having to experience all of the shame that comes from being rejected or abandoned. But on the outside, you're showing this veneer of capability and almost being perfect. But inside, it's covering up a lot of shame. It's covering up a lot of low self-esteem. People like this tend to be workaholics as well. Why? Well, how can you be perfect if you're not working hard all the time? And I don't mean workaholic in terms of just money. I mean working hard at everything, trying to have the right body, trying to have the right education. All of it comes down to being a workaholic. So how is this going to play out? Typically, a person who is run by shame, who is making up for it by trying to do everything perfectly, but being used to and having the identity of people around them that just don't know how to love them the right way. No matter what they do, they still don't get the love that they want. Unfortunately, typically, not always, but what could happen is there's a very high likelihood that you're going to marry or try to be in a long-term relationship with somebody that's equal to your unresolved trauma. Again, what is that trauma? Up against shame, try to put the veneer over it of perfectionism and connect to somebody who you want them to need you, but they don't have the ability to love you back. So you don't do it because it's good for you. You do it unconsciously, and you do it because it's familiar. Continuing, there's a high likelihood that you're going to marry somebody or be in a long-term relationship with somebody who makes you feel needed or that their needs are easily met. We'll go back over that one in a second. There's also a high likelihood that you're going to marry somebody who can't love you the way you want. So let's go back to the beginning again. Why would you be with somebody whose needs are easily met? Because you think you can shine, because it's an easy win, because you've spent your whole life or your childhood trying to please people who are not pleasable. And so now you see somebody that might need you or that is needy, that their needs might be easily met. And so this looks like an easy way to get the love and attention that you want. Because if you give that attention to somebody else, if you give them what they need, for sure they're going to appreciate it. For sure they're going to be loyal to you. But does that happen all the time? No, most of the time it doesn't. So what am I talking about here when I say you're looking for somebody whose needs are easily met? You can get a strong, powerful, successful person. And I live in Las Vegas, so let me just add this part to it, because I've had a lot of men talk about this before, and they're not understanding the situation, so now's the time to take a look at it. They get involved with a lot of strippers. Strippers tend to be extremely needy. They get involved with women that are in debt. They get involved with women that are not treated correctly, typically within their life. In other words, they've been verbally abused or physically abused, or just being treated very poorly in relationships. Now, should any of this be attractive? Not if you're completely healthy, it's not. But why is it attractive to a person who has imposter syndrome? In other words, again, they're working from a core of shame and not feeling good enough. And they have the need to be needed. Well, it seems easy that if you're dealing with a person who's in debt, if you give them some money, problem solved. They should love you, right? What about a woman who has a history of being treated poorly in relationships or getting beat up in relationships? Well, all you got to do is act like a halfway decent human being. And she's going to love that. So therefore, now you're in a connected, attached relationship, and she's got to love you back because you're giving her something that she needs that she's never had before. It seems like an easy way to win and to be in a relationship. And man after man after man that I talk to, they've been in this situation a million times and they still don't get it. It's unfortunate. So as we go over this, again, they're getting connected to a person who, down below all that, they're not going to be able to love them the way they want. So going back, typically the strategy is to work harder, to take on more responsibility. And when you do that, you can fix people's problems. They're going to love you. They're going to see you. They're going to appreciate you. But it doesn't work. And here's another couple of philosophical thoughts of why that won't. Number one, many people don't fall in love with you. They fall in love with how you make them feel. Very important. Let me give you the other one before we drill down further. People only accept the love that they believe that they deserve. So here's the point. When you're trying to go out of your way to help somebody, not always, but many times, if a person, for example, has been treated poorly in relationships, they have a bad view of men, they've been physically abused, emotionally abused, verbally abused, and you go in there and you act nice, it doesn't solve the problem of their low self-esteem. They will take the compliments for a while, and if they need money, they'll take the money. Why? Because it's necessary, they need it. However, They're only going to accept the amount of love that they think they deserve, which typically, if a person has had that hard of a life and they've done none of the work to make themselves better, they're not going to love you. They will accept your time. They will accept your money. They will accept all the things that you do for them to get their day a little bit better, to get their basic needs met. But to love you, it comes to the second part. They fall in love with how you make them feel. If they have low self-esteem and you're treating them like a queen, there's a dissonance there or an incongruence. It doesn't fit. They don't feel right. The more you help them in a certain way, above and beyond what their basic needs are, the more that they're going to feel that they're not worthy to be cared about. They're not worthy to be loved by somebody who has what looks like a good life, or with positivity, or a grasp of life in a good way. In other words, again, high up on the socioeconomic ladder and maybe educated, knowing how to speak, and not having any visual problems that you can see. Continuing with that, here is the other part in terms of imposter syndrome. If you go through all this and you think it's the easy way out to go and find people who are needy or be attracted to that unconsciously, it circles around, because this is probably the biggest self-esteem killer there is because the people that you love, the people that you invest in, the people that you care for, they are going to have a better relationship with somebody else who's just a shadow of you, because they feel more comfortable in a different environment. They don't feel worthy to be with somebody who's helping them all the time. Not for a long-term relationship, not unless they do the work on themselves. This part's really interesting when you think about it, because going back to imposter syndrome, the imposter syndrome starts with what I said right up at the top. Somebody with shame, somebody who doesn't feel good enough, somebody who's trying to be successful incredibly in a lot of areas, but inside they don't feel that successful. So that's one version of imposter syndrome. However, on the other side of that, of low self-esteem, is somebody who basically gives up. So we're looking at two people here who have imposter syndrome. Because if you help somebody and they don't do anything for their insides to make themselves feel better about themselves, and they still have all that insecurity, they're going to reject the love that comes their way. Because even if you're in a relationship with a person like that and it's going well, they are going to feel like an imposter. So now we have two imposters. This is how it generally works. Now, I forgot to say this at the beginning of the show. I want to take some of these details and I want to put some realism into it, because I think some of this gets to be a little bit difficult to hear and it's hard to place it on your own lives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you two examples of things that have happened in my life that kind of coincide with this kind of thing. I think enough time has passed. I was very young. It was like way over 30 years ago. So let's bring some of this back and let's see how some of this imposter syndrome can work. So this goes back a long time ago. I was in a relationship with somebody and I was moving up the ladder. I was getting my first real job. I was getting modeling jobs on top of that. The girl I was with, she didn't want to improve her education. She became a person who was very much into alcohol and drugs. And long story short, she didn't feel comfortable around me anymore. And again, I wish I had somebody to do a show like this back when I was young, because I couldn't understand how I could keep trying to get better and better and better. And her and other people that I know that were in relationships, they tend to go down the ladder for some reasons, and as I'd mentioned before. So she ended up going with this guy who was an alcoholic who had no education. And so that was that, or so you might think. However, she comes back about 6 months later with two things. Number one, herpes. Number two, she was pregnant. And of course, she tried to say that I was the father. Why? Because I was a good long-term investment, because I had a pretty good job and I had ambition and I had a chance to make more money because of my education. So financially, I was a good bet. But emotionally, I was not, because she never felt comfortable around me. So she went for a long-term relationship or whatever with some guy, again, that was completely on the opposite end. Some guy that could barely hold a job and who had drug and alcohol issues. That's who she really felt comfortable with inside. And at that very young age, I just could not understand that at all. Lesson number two, I buy a house and I'm ready to go. I ended up in a relationship with this woman. Fast forward, she ended up going back with her ex, and he was 20 years older than her, and I was, let's see, so that means he was 28 years older than me. 28 years older than me. And he was a heroin addict. So we're back to the drugs again. So he ended up winning some money in a settlement. So he had the financial part. Now, what was the emotional part to that? Well, as she would say, I was a threat to her sobriety because she was anxious around me all the time. Now, why would that be? Well, from her words back then, as much as I can recall from this long ago, but I was 8 years younger than her. So she always felt that I would have better options and my options would increase year after year because she would be older than me. And so she was very uncomfortable with being around me. And she didn't think that this other guy that she wanted to be with was attractive to other women at all, which, he had drug issues for many years. Let's just say he was not very healthy looking. He was old, and no, he was not attractive on pretty much anybody's perception there. So, but this made her feel comfortable. It made her feel comfortable because he wouldn't have options. So she knew that this guy couldn't do any better than her, but she thought that I could always do better than her. Again, low self-esteem. It's the imposter syndrome comes back, because underneath her success and underneath everything that was going well, she still felt that she needed to be with somebody that offered some type of comfort, but comfort in the fact of he wasn't that attractive. So again, as a young person looking back, you're sitting there saying, okay, I've done all of these things that society says that you should do in order to be attractive, to minimize the thought of being rejected, to minimize the thought of being abandoned. And it doesn't work. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that you want to meet somebody who's at your level emotionally. And no matter how high up the ladder you think you get, no matter how you think you're perfect in a lot of ways, you have to realize that perfection is going to turn off as many people as it turns on. So if you choose to go for a person who has low self-esteem, you're going to trigger their imposter syndrome, because they don't feel good enough to be with you. And that's going to be a problem. And the reason why you're choosing people like that is because you have the need to be needed, and you think that if you fix people, they're going to love you. It would make sense. It's easy because you couldn't figure out how to please your parents. They were impossible to please. But if you see somebody with obvious needs, and you know you can fulfill those needs, it just seems like it was a match made in heaven, but it's not. So hopefully this was somewhat educational for you. My name is Joe Peroni. This is the Rise Above Project. Please subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you.